Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what is our third Creative Tech Seminar of 2026. Um, for those of you who still don't know who we are a policy and evidence center funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council. We are based at Newcastle University, working in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts in London. And our mission is to support the UK creative industry's growth through independent and authoritative research and policy advice. At the same time, we want to advance research into the longer term challenges of the sector and opportunities, and not just nationally, but globally. And this seminar series is designed to showcase cutting edge research and foster dialogue across academia, policy, and creative practice. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's seminar. Professor Joel Waldfogel doesn't really need my introduction, but here it is. So Joel is the Fredericks Couple Chair in Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management and the Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was previously at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and before that at Yale University. Was also Kevin Stein Scholar at the U.S. Copyright Office during 2021-22. Now, Joel's main broad research interests are industrial organization and law and economics, and has conducted pioneering empirical studies on issues related to digital products, including piracy, pricing, revenue sharing, and the effects of digitization and the supply of new products. And now on to today's seminar. Joel is going to talk about the diffusion of large language models and how these are seen since their introduction. We've seen a tripling of new book releases, which raises the question of the impact of these models on the quality of books. Together with Inka Reimers, they have looked at how the diffusion of LLMs has reshaped the publishing sector and how it has impacted both the volume and perceived quality of books entering the market. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the presentation, so before giving Joel the virtual floor, a quick reminder of etiquette. For all those who are online, the seminar is being recorded, and following Joel's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and I'll do my best to bring your questions to Joel. Thank you for your cooperation. Now, without any further ado, join me in warmly welcoming Professor Joel Waldfogel.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. So yes, let me talk about this paper, which is joint, as you mentioned, with Imka Reimers, who's a professor at Cornell. So this paper is called AI and the Quantity and Quality of Creative Products, Have LLMs Boosted Creation of Valuable Books. But what I want to say, even on the title slide, is the word quality is meant in the way that economists mean the word. It's not an aesthetic term. It's really a term about the usefulness of products, the extent to which people are willing to purchase them. So if the word quality is in any way off-putting for its connotations about cultural value, think of it instead the way we intend it. It's just, is it useful to people? Would they buy it? That sort of thing. Okay, so a little bit of background, sort of prior to this project, and it helps contextualize this project, is just to think about technology and the creative industries, and to think of the last, I don't know, 25 years or so have been pretty fascinating. 30 years or so have been pretty interesting for these sets of industries. The pre-1999 world is a world, and that's pre-Napster, is a world in which there are very high costs of producing products. And that's true for movies, it's true for music, it's really true for books as well. These are high investment industries. And so we have these gatekeeping investors, the record labels, the book publishers, the movie studios, who decide, hey, should I greenlight a project or not? And they have to sort of use their best guess about, is this likely to succeed? Because it's expensive. It is, at least the way they had used to do it, it's very expensive. Well, then digitization arrives. The first manifestation of digitization was piracy, and that was sort of catastrophic impacts on the recorded music industry. They were the canary in the coal mine. Revenue fell by something like 70%. But not long after, I think we realized as a community that there was also an enormous reduction in the cost of producing or bringing to market new products. And we saw not, against the backdrop of a collapse of revenue, the technological change that reduced cost brought us explosions of new products and brought to us without gatekeeping permissions. So what I'm thinking of here are independent music and film, self-published books, just a radically liberalized distribution environment. Now, in general, like if you get a whole bunch of new products, it might not be good, but as it turns out in this context, and frankly in many others, it's very unpredictable which products will turn out to be valuable to consumers. That's especially true in cultural products, and people have noted it for a long time. I love the William Goldman "nobody knows anything" mantra, but it's documented by academics as well, like Richard Caves. So when quality is really unpredictable, then having an explosion in number of new products, maybe a lot of it's bad, but some of it might turn out to be good. And the good stuff, and again, good simply meaning appealing to some people, some right tail best-selling stuff, that's what matters. And so that was sort of a research program I pursued in a whole bunch of papers and ultimately culminating in this book, Digital Renaissance, I published in 2018. Well, that sets up a little context here because now we have another, let's say, cost-reducing technology, LLMs, that could be helpful for producing certain sorts of products. And so if the earlier era was an era of democratization, here we have kind of the mechanization. But I don't want to draw the analogy too tightly. I just want to use this as a setup. So LLMs arrive. We all know this. Here's the, if you look at Google Trends searches on ChatGPT, this one, by the way, compares ChatGPT to Taylor Swift, just to tell you that ChatGPT is really a cultural phenomenon. People are more interested than Taylor Swift. But another version of this picture compares ChatGPT to other LLMs, and this is by far the most popular one. And I guess the point to say is something like an event happened right around the beginning of 2023. Something like an event. Big jump in ChatGPT interest during 23. And what's going on now is LLMs could now produce long stretches of text, which is kind of what books are made of. I mean, I realize there's more to it than that, but in some sense, that's what books are. And authors, didn't fail to notice this. In a 2025 survey, almost half of authors reported using ChatGPT in some form. They, whether for research or for whatever. But at the same time, of those who weren't using it, about 3/4 thought it was unethical. So it's not without its controversy, and that's not a surprise. That's not news coming from me. All right. So just before I get to the sort of heart of this stuff, there's other, sort of indirect effects of AI. If you look at, and I haven't told you about the data yet, so I apologize for that, but if you look at the most prolific authors in the sample that we'll put together, and you ask, well, how prolific is, say, the 10th most prolific author by year? And in a year like 2010, we're talking about somebody producing 15 books, which is astronomical. Stephen King only writes 2 books a year. But it sort of slowly grows 2020. But in the last couple of years, in 2025, the 10th most prolific author in the sample that we'll describe in a minute or a few minutes is producing 100 books. And there's somebody in the sample who produced 475 books during 2000 or 472 during 2075. So, one suspects something other than just, let's say, industriousness is at work here, than rather it's AI. Okay. But what are the questions, to get back to the sort of main story here? The main questions we're after here. First, how did LLMs affect the number of books created? And second, are AI generated or AI assisted books, are they better or worse? Again, in the sense of being useful to consumers. And to say it another way, what does the increase in the number of books, some of which are created with AI, do to the distribution of qualities or appeals of the books that get created? And some subsidiary questions, well, then what does this mean for consumers? So the economics way of keeping score is something called consumer surplus, but frankly, we'll be able to see whatever we need to see almost in the raw data. And then there are some last questions we're after about who uses AI, which among the authors, new versus old, successful versus unsuccessful, and what does it do to incumbent authors? Are they finding themselves displaced by AI or what? Okay, and so we're going to go after these questions using 2 approaches. One, I would call the indirect approach, where what we'll do is we'll look at the great growth in books and ask whether the periods and genres that have great growth, do they have differential changes in the apparent quality of their products? But we'll also have a very direct approach where we'll have a bunch of books where we've done AI detection on samples of the books, and we can say something directly comparing the books that contain AI to the books that do not. All right. So a little bit of a theoretical framework is helpful just for structuring the questions that we can pose with the data. And it's a theoretical framework aimed at trying to set up the question, when is getting more stuff actually valuable? Meaning more new products. So what matters for consumer welfare in the economic way of thinking about it is both the distribution of product qualities and the number of products created. And so, as backdrop, is this digital renaissance again? Is this a whole bunch of new products, including products at the right tail of the distribution and products at the left tail? Or is this, something else? Are LLMs producing things that are primarily not so good? But I don't want to get ahead of myself. But how do these change with the advent of LLMs? So let's think of some hypothetical cases just to guide the empirical inquiry. This is not an assertion about truth, but just a way of organizing the questions. So let's suppose, again, not something we think is true, but helpful for structuring questions. Let's suppose AI books have the same quality distribution as human-generated books. And so what happens, let's suppose, is just an increase in the number of new books coming out. If that were the case, then after LLMs arrived, we'd have the same average quality of books, because again, we're just getting more from the same distribution. Let's say the X percentile, or be specific, the 90th percentile book would be at the same quality as the 90th percentile book before. But, and this is kind of important, the number of new works above any particular threshold, however, would increase, right? If we have the 90th percentile book is as good as before, but we have twice as many new books, that means we have twice as many books above that same threshold. So maybe a more plausible case to think about, what would happen if the LLM distribution, let's say the post-LLM, the red one, which is representing more new books, let's say it's got a lower mean, but a higher number of books than the pre-LLM distribution. Well, then what would happen is the post-LLM average would fall. This red line is to the left of the blue line. The average would go down. What's also true, if you look at fixed percentiles of the distribution, well, that would also fall too. So the 95th percentile book would be worse than before, because the whole distribution is shifted to the left. But again, the thing that's potentially different is, let's say that consider the book at a rank position, like the 200th best book. Well, now, since there are so many more books, even though they're worse on average, it could be that we end up with more books above some, particular absolute threshold. So there ends up being a horse race here that involves, again, two things: the number of new books and those distributions of their usefulness or quality. All right, so I think this is repetitive, but let me just say it again because it's kind of important for guiding our questions. If the number of books rises, number of new books, but the average quality falls, then the effects on welfare are unclear. The horse race, especially for consumer surplus, is about whether LLMs deliver more books at or near the top of the quality distribution. So our empirical tasks really are to ask two questions. What happens to the number of new books, and what happens to the distribution of their, and I'll keep saying the word quality, but just think of it as usefulness or usage, the appeal to usage. All right, so data are not a trivial problem in this context. This is not something that in some sense is easy just to go look up the answer, like how many books are there. So what we're going to be looking at, ebooks published on Amazon, but let me just talk a little bit about the challenges. So one might think that there are ways to get the number of books produced, and historically there have been. Like the Copyright Office in the US and other places, one could look at copyright registrations, but one does not have to register a copyright to publish a book. And in fact, since the digital revolution, generally, there has been barely an increase in the number of copyright registrations for books, but there's been a huge increase, like after the Kindle came out and people started self-publishing ebooks, huge increase. So the Copyright Office is not a good source of information on the number of books created. There's an international standard book number organization, and one might think, one could look at the number of ISBNs issued, and that is somewhat informative. But the truth is, you don't need an ISBN to produce a book, and many books that are produced to be distributed through Amazon do not have ISBNs. So again, there's no simple index to go look at. So I guess I'm telling you this just to say that data collection and data assembly in this context is an interesting bit of detective work. So here's what we come up with, and I'll tell you how we got it in a minute. So the underlying data set here is going to be all English language books that appear as ebooks and appear on Amazon between January of 2020 and December of 2025. So what we will have is we'll have the aggregate data, the number of books released by genre. So Amazon has those 30 or so different top level book categories. So we'll have the number by category and by month for this 6-year period. Then at the level of the book, well, we're going to have some measures of demand and usage as well as AI status. And I'll go into a little more detail in a minute. There will be two samples sort of interest here. One, the main sample we'll study is going to be representative of all these books released. We would also like to study some questions related to artist careers, or in this case, author careers. So for that, we're going to collect all the books released in a few smallish categories back to 2008. So we can see, what's happening to people, post LLMs, based on what they did before. But that's a subset of the analysis that I'll come to toward the end. All right, so the detective work. How can we see the number of books? So NCT is going to be the number of books appearing in month T in category C. So what we do for that is if you go to Amazon's website, they have an advanced book search feature. And you can query this feature for the number. So we ask for new, that is not used, new books, Kindle format, so ebooks, in English, by publication month and by subject category. So we asked it for that. And what it gives you back is, let's see if I can get my thing to move. There we go. If you get the number of results or the number of pages. So if you look on the right here, what's boxed, it says 1 of 16 of 621 results. So in that context, it says, well, there are 621 books in that month in that category. And that, that's great, except that actually it only gives you the number up to a certain number. So we also observe the number of pages. If you see the lower box down there, it says, I can't quite see it, it says 39 pages. We know there are 16 results on a page. So in any event, this is a little bit boring, but if it's 1 to a 999, we observe the number of books in that category in that month. If it's 1,000 to 6,400, we observe the number of pages, but only up to 400 pages. That they don't report after that. Beyond that, it's reported only within 1,000. So what all this means is, you should have some sympathy on us, the hard work we had to do to look at subcategories to get accurate counts. But anyways, one can, with a little bit of sleuthing and maybe ingenuity, get the number of books released by month and by category. All right, so I already said this, but what we end up though, so we can't collect the book level data for all the books. It's going to turn out that there are 10 million books in this time period. So what we'll do is we'll get we'll choose a random sample, a stratified random sample of 330,000 books. So we have representation across categories and months for the whole period. And we know the weights, since we know the number of books, the underlying number of books, we have the weights to create population representative numbers. Okay, now in contrast to that though, that subsample where we looked at small categories going all the way back to 2008, there we observed the entire universe or the full census of books in those categories from 2008 up to 2025. All right, so what do we have? For all the books in the sample, what we get from Amazon is we get their category and publication month, that's how we sampled them. We observe the price, the number of ratings they have accumulated by April 2026. Now, that's not the same as the star rating. It's the number of people who have left a star rating. We also observe the average number of stars for the books with star ratings. We also observe the sales rank as of essentially the end of the sample period. We also observe whether it's available as a hardcover book, but we sampled on ebooks. Now, essentially every real book is published also as an ebook. There are a lot of books since the self-publishing revolution that really only manifest themselves as ebooks. Then for a random and a further random subset, 50,000 books, we run them through AI detection software. And so we take 1,000-word samples. This took a little bit of interesting work, if you don't mind me spending a minute on what we did with our winter vacation. So all of the ebooks at Amazon have it's not search inside the book, it's just a preview feature. And so you go into the preview feature and you can see some part of the book. So we took 1,000 words from each of them and then we ran it through the Pangram AI detector, which has, although AI detection, some work better than others, this one has been shown to be to be very, very good, very low false positive rates and so forth. Okay, so we end up with this sample. Let me focus on the top of this page for a minute. 10 million underlying books. Again, we know that it's that many. We don't observe all 10 million. The middle where it says raw, there are 331,000 books in the actual sample. And then the AI detection sample among those category books is 48,000. Maybe I'll move on rather than talk in detail about all these particular numbers. All right, let's get to some results. So one of my results has already been given away, but let me just say, here's the number of books being released by month, by time. And you see from early in January, early in 2020 till late in 2022, it's pretty steady, around 100,000 books per month. And then right toward the end of 22, which by the way is just when ChatGPT kicks in, we see a rather rapid increase in the number of books released that reaches, 3 times as high, 300,000 per month by mid to late 2025. So the number of books published rises a lot. Now, I suppose one could say, what do you mean by books and what do you mean by published? But we can get back to that if we want to. Now, maybe there's no debate about this, but we're going to just try to convince you this is driven by AI. I mean, for one thing, it happens when ChatGPT appears, when ChatGPT is popular. But what's also true is that if you look at the share of books detected to contain AI, turns out that share is really close to the share that would be implied to have been AI if you thought the increase above the baseline 100,000 per month were all AI. So this picture here shows you the AI detected share and the implied AI detected share. Again, where the implied share is, hey, what if the whole increase relative to what it used to be were AI? And they track each other pretty well. So maybe there's not a lot of controversy about this. AI seems responsible for this rather, remarkable growth in the number of new books being released by month. I don't know what priors one has about this. Where would one expect it? Sort of romance is what one always thinks about, but romance is actually in the middle here. It's like on the order of a tripling. Whereas on the right, we have self-help, sports and outdoors and travel. These are like 9.1 times increase in the number of new travel books. And sports and outdoors and self-help aren't too far behind. Literature and fiction actually is at the low end, but there are various particular kinds of literature or fiction, I should say, like mystery, thriller, suspense, romance, which are there around 3. They're to the right of the middle of the diagram. So there are big increases. I mean, it's not that they're not big, they're just not the biggest. Okay, so the number of books went up. Maybe that's not a surprise, but it took a little work to document it. Well, now, what about quality and usage? So this is sort of the big question. And remember, I said we have an indirect approach and a direct approach. And so I want to talk about how we do the indirect approach, and it has some data shortcomings. There's an elephant in the room there. So we wish we had the quantities sold by title over time. That's what we wish we had. Amazon is not terribly forthcoming with this kind of information, so we don't have that. What we have is the number of ratings that a book has obtained as of early 2026. So, there are a couple of potential issues here. First of all, the number of ratings is not equal to the number of units sold, although we're going to try to convince you that it's a useful proxy for that. But what's also true is that younger books have had a lot less time to receive ratings than older books, and the younger books aren't worse, they're just newer. So we have to really think about this. And I should also mention, though, that some of our approaches aren't going to be dependent on these things, but some of them are. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So potential issue number 1, ratings versus units sold. Is the number of ratings a book has received a reasonable reflection of its sales? Well, we have a different data set from an earlier time period where we have daily sales data and ratings, number of ratings received data cumulatively for a lot of books at Amazon. And in those data, what we can do is we can look sort of at, and this graph shows you, days since release, and then on the vertical axis is the correlation between the number of ratings received and the sales. And you can see that they're pretty correlated. By the time you get to 200 days after release, half a year or so after release, we're at 0.6, a pretty high correlation. So that's going to be our justification for using the number of ratings received as a measure. But again, we have alternatives to this too. So if this one bothers you, we might have something else that doesn't bother you as much. The other question is, how do we make books commensurable, given that some books just came out and haven't had much time to get ratings, and other books came out 5 years ago? So what we do is we don't have a full time series of numbers of ratings. We did collect ratings at a couple of points in time, both in February and April of 2026. And what we can see happening in that time period is the growth in the number of ratings that books have just as they age. So we can get basically the aging pattern that allows us to translate the number of ratings you have, given how old you are, to an implied number of ratings you would have if you were, say, 60 months old. All right, so we can make books, make the rating measure, number of ratings received measure, comparable across books by using this adjustment factor. All right. But here again, I want to say we have a number of our measurement approaches that don't rely on this. So if this is bothering you, and it would bother me if it's all we had, don't worry too much. So we're saying elephant in the room, go away. Let's, elephant be damned. Let's go forward. All right. So again, in just getting to the indirect measures of this question of quality, what we're thinking of, remember from the little framework, we'd like to know what happens to essentially the number of ratings at the average, at percentiles of the distribution, and at absolute rank positions of the distribution. And so there are sort of three ways we can look at this. One we call the temporal approach. Let's just look and see before and after LLM arrival, what happens to the qualities of books. A second approach is a variant on that asks, well, let's look at the categories of books with big increases that are in some sense heavily treated by LLMs and compare those categories to those lightly treated by LLMs and ask, does quality fall on average? Does quality fall at percentiles? What happens to quality at particular rank positions in the highly treated versus the less treated? And the last one just takes that a little further and says, let's use the continuous measure of the number of books being released by category and month and ask whether is this usage measure, if you like, or quality, is it falling faster in categories growing more quickly relative to those growing less quickly? And same things again about the percentiles and the absolute rank positions. So pictures are better than more words at this point. Let me just show you a picture. So this is the temporal approach, and we're just looking at essentially measures of this average quality. And the vertical line there is where ChatGPT arrives. And we see that the quality afterwards, or the usage afterwards, has fallen. This is below the average for the previous period. We can do the same thing, ask the same question about what happens at percentiles of the distribution, and it looks very similar. We see reductions at percentiles of the distribution. But finally, we can ask the same question about absolute rank positions. And that one looks pretty different. That one rises. What's going on here? Well, the enormous increase in the number of books, although they're worse on average, and even they're worse at any percentile distribution, there are so many new books that say the number of books, the number of books in the top 100 or top 200 or something like that is actually rising. I'll have more to say that in a few minutes. All right, so I will spare you the gory details. I said the high-low approach, does the same thing, but asks what happens at heavily treated versus less treated. But let me just give you some pictures. The left-hand side pictures we've already seen. The right-hand side pictures are the analogous pictures coming out of the high-low approach. And the point to take away is they look very similar. That is, we get reductions at the mean, we get reductions at percentiles, we get increases at the, the absolute level. That is, at the 1 to 100, 2 to 200, or 100 to 200, rather, 200 to 300, and so forth. Meaning the 0 or 1 to 100th best book by category by month, the 101 to 200th best book by category by month. All right, so finally in the indirect approach to this quality question, we can ask, how does the quality measure vary with the number of books being released here, the log of NCT in this regression. And we can also do the percentile thing by adding fixed effects for the percentiles or for the absolute rank positions. And the point to say, it's probably getting a little dull by now, but we get very, very similar results. That is, the first set of here is where it says average. These negative numbers mean that in categories that grow faster, we have bigger reductions at the average in the average quality. In categories that grow faster, we have bigger reductions at any percentile. In categories that grow faster, we have increases conditional on absolute rank position, or at any absolute rank position. So, having said that, I want to qualify that last result in one way. So I'm saying, hey, it's getting better at any rank position, but is that really true? we can divide that result out by basically points in the distribution. We can say, well, what's it happening for the first 1 to 200, 200 to 400, and so forth? And what you see is actually, although this coefficient is positive, it's 0 for the 1 to 200th within category and month. So that already tells you something really important. I've been saying we're getting increases in quality, but these increases in quality, again, are outside the top 200 books released by category and by month. So these are nowhere near the bestseller distribution because there are like 30 categories here. So we're talking about books outside the top 200 by month. So maybe there will be some value here to consumers, but we're not talking about AI, being used to create books that are enormously, the most valuable kinds of books for consumers. That's going to be a theme that runs through the rest of the results. Okay, now the direct approach. And I guess if you're fans of Indiana Jones, you might remember the scene where there's this sort of swashbuckling character who does all kinds of fancy things, and then Indiana Jones sort of gets a little fed up and just shoots him with a pistol. And that's kind of what we're going to do here. Maybe that was the swashbuckling indirect approach before, but now let's just go ahead and compare books that contain AI to those that do not, using that AI detection sample. And so the short answer is that AI books are worse. And so why do I say that? Well, if we look at these, this measure of usage, so columns 1 and 2. So these are regressions of these adjusted usage measures on category fixed effects and month in which the book was released. And now we're making a head-to-head comparison, that is within category and month between the AI containing books and the non-AI containing books. And these negative coefficients just tell you that the AI containing books are less used. So they're in that sense worse. The right-hand side measure, so, one might worry, there's so many things to worry about. Like one might worry about number of ratings, one might worry about like, fake reviews or contamination or differential tendencies to rate. So one way around that is just to literally get the sales ranks, which we have for a point in time. And the sales ranks for the AI containing books, here we have positive numbers because higher ranks mean worse sales. So you get a very similar message emerging from the sales rank measure. These AI books are worse in the sense that they get less usage, measured by number of star ratings received. They're also worse measured by the sales ranks. There isn't a slide, but we also did this with the average star rating, which in some sense is a very common kind of lay measure of quality. And AI books indeed have worse star ratings. Now I'm talking about their average as opposed to the number of ratings received than non-AI books. So let me just show you sort of the AI versus non-AI pictorially. So prior to 2023, let's just go ahead and assume that all books are human, because that's essentially right. It's not till late in 22 that we get any AI. So this is a measure of quality over time, the average quality for books. And then we have after the 2000, in the AI period, we can distinguish with our AI sample between books that are human, that is contain no AI, versus books that contain AI. So the human ones, it's essentially flat. We could quibble a little bit about whether it seems to be falling over time. But then let's layer onto this picture the AI books. They're much worse, much lower. And we can compute the average just in some sense to describe what it is that we were doing before in the indirect approach. We were trying to come up with the thing we can just directly measure here. This average, the middle, I guess, dashed line, the overall, is falling over time because of this mix of very low quality AI books and the higher quality human books. One other thing that's a little bit interesting in this picture that I'll talk more about in a second is that the AI human gap does seem to be shrinking over time in this picture, which raises some questions that we can partially address. Another way to visualize what's going on is to look at these distributions. So I'd call this a quality distribution, but really just think of it as in some sense this distribution of these usage measures across books. So here's 2020, and this is a year in which there are no AI books. So this is all just depicted as gray. Now let's look at the same picture for 23. Now the dark gray is AI books, and look where they are. They're at the left end of the distribution. They're not very good, and there are not that many of them in 23. Here's 24. They're again pretty skewed to the left, but there are some kind of in the middle, a few random ones that are higher up. But basically, what we're seeing, pictorially, is just what I think the regressions were telling us a little while ago. AI is delivering mostly low quality stuff, some sort of middling stuff. And there's 25, the year in which there's an enormous number. So again, a lot of pretty low quality stuff or low in the distribution, and some stuff, more nearer to the top. So what's the bottom line on this quality stuff? I guess from our perspective, there's a huge increase in the number of products. There's a decrease in average quality. It's driven by both the increase in number and decrease in quality are driven by the AI books. There is an increase in the quality conditional on ranked positions, but not at the very top, not for the top 200 by category and month. And all those results hold both for the basic measure of usage, but also for sales rankings and for average star ratings. All right, so now just to maybe, this is almost pointless. If you were to say, even without looking at the next few slides, so what does this mean for consumers? Well, by construction, if there are some new products available, even if they're not very good, the way an economist would think about it is, well, okay, we're better off in the sense that we have some more choices. Now, there is an interesting question of whether we can navigate our way to them. But we already know it's not going to be huge because we're not seeing a bunch of new bestsellers that are being driven by AI. But then, we can still compute this measure called consumer surplus. And so the thought experiment here, is to take each year, 2020 to 25, and within each of those years, let's just think of the total set of books available and compare that to the total set of books if we remove the AI books. So thinking about the AI books as sort of the additional gift that AI has given us. And so we're asking, what's the welfare change if we were evaluating each year as though that were the totality of all books? So it's a thought experiment about what if the book creation process for all eternity resembled first 2023, then for all eternity 2024, and so forth. And so there's a formula. And so what we do here is we use a nested logit welfare approach, and we use parameters estimated in earlier work that Imke and I have done for book demand. So it's just think of it as kind of a loose calibration approach. So what do we get? Well, you see again some things we've already seen. The number of books per year was in 2022, 1.2 million, so it's 100,000 per month, I said before. We see the number of books rising to 1.8 million, 1.8 million again, 3.1 million across these years. The AI share we see there, 23. It's essentially zero before, 23, 34, 53%. And then these sort of changes in consumer surplus, well, we're saying in our sort of baseline estimates, it's a very small increase, 0.5% in 2023. 3.3% in 2024, 7-ish% in 2025. These are sensitivity to different possible substitution parameters. This should not be viewed as precise estimates of anything. I think it just tells you what you already saw. We're getting a bunch of stuff, most of which isn't very good, but there is some benefit to consumers from some middle quality stuff. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about mechanisms, then I'll be done. We have, I guess, a little time. So one question is, who's making use of LLMs? Is it good or bad authors? And how does AI affect incumbent authors' productivity, the displacement question? So for this, we're now using that so-called census sample, where we got all the books released in 8 small subcategories, small enough that given our data collection constraints, we could get all of them. So one question is, the tendency to use AI according to pre-LLM author experience on the x-axis here. So 0 is new authors. They have no pre-LLM author experience. And we see is 40% of those authors with no pre-LLM experience are using AI. Whereas the authors who existed before are much less likely. It's frankly just about a constant 10-ish% for the incumbent guys, but it's like over 40% for the new entrants using AI. So new guys are the guys using AI. Among those, though, who are returning, among the folks who had written books before, we could ask the question, is it the formerly successful or formerly less successful authors? And what you see here is that along the x-axis is the pre-AI success decile. And again, success is a crude kind of measure. It's based on sort of the usage of your past books. So again, an economist approach to success. But what you see is that the less successful are the ones more likely to be using AI. Okay, and the more successful, less likely. Now, remember I showed you this picture and I said, looks like AI is catching up because that blue line is kind of getting closer to the human line in this picture. So we can do a little bit to explore that. So starting in the first part of this table just reproduces the idea that AI generated books are worse than non-AI generated books. In the second column, we measure the extent to which they're worse year by year. And you see these big numbers, minus 2.2, minus 1.9, minus 1.5. But then what column 3 does is it adds an author fixed effect so that now these AI coefficients are now going to be identified within author. So from authors some of whose books have AI and some of whose books do not have AI. Whereas in column 2, so in column 2, the effect was, or I should say the coefficient was attributable to some combination of whether AI, in some sense makes your book worse or whether a worse author is using it. Well, when you account for who's using it and do the estimation within, the coefficients are much, much smaller. That minus 2 becomes minus 0.4, and the minus 1.9 becomes minus 0.3. So a lot of what makes AI books bad, this would imply, is just the selection of, in some sense, low quality authors into the use of AI. But even after accounting for that, the AI books are worse. Now, the other thing to note here in column 3 is, as in column 2, is the coefficients are getting smaller over time. So that's that gap shrinking. And you might wonder, so what is that? Like AI could be getting better, authors could be getting better because of their experience using AI. The last column adds this measure, number of prior AI books. And frankly, that doesn't pick much of anything up. And so that leaves us at least with a suggestion that what's happening is that AI is getting better over time. So there's a spooky science fiction kind of theme to think about. All right, oh yes, and lastly, this question of incumbents being displaced. So we can do a little bit about this. So one thing we can do again with that census sample is we can say, well, okay, let's calculate the number of authors whose first book was released at time V, vintage V. That's their debut year. How many of the authors who debuted at time V, how many books do they collectively release at time T, in month T? And so in general, if you think about sort of artist careers, you might think that there's some aging effect. There's some aging effect, so over time I might become maybe more and then eventually less productive. But after accounting for the aging effect, what's happening to me over time, over calendar time? So what we do here is we include only the authors born, that is to say their first book appeared before AI existed. And we ask the question, how do these time effects, these calendar time effects, which is essentially the productivity of this group after accounting for their their general aging as authors. And what we get when we do that is a curve that slopes up. That is, after the appearance of ChatGPT, these folks who were already active become more active. Okay, so this doesn't look like displacement. This looks like something else. This looks like people perhaps adopting AI, but not being pushed out. Now, I should say that limitations here, this is about productivity, number of books produced. This isn't about sales or something. This isn't telling us whether the incumbents are economically harmed by by sales displacement. Rather, it's just telling us whether they're in some sense being pushed out. Okay, so incumbents are writing more now, not less. All right, so I'm about done. Machines can now produce text. There are a lot of new books. Most of them attract little usage. A few of them are pretty good, not very good, but pretty good. And there are modest improvements in consumer surplus for the well-being of consumers who face this market and, because of the new products. There's a lot of entry, mostly by, quote, bad, meaning producing books of little interest to people. But incumbents produce more too. Now, I frankly don't know why I put this picture of John Grisham here, because he's not really being affected. He's the bestseller guy who skates above all of this phenomenon, at least for now. Lastly, I guess I did want to give ChatGPT the chance for the last word. So I asked ChatGPT for a limerick. Even if ChatGPT isn't writing great books, I think ChatGPT is a really good limerick writer. And so this summarizes the paper. There once was a bright little bot whose novels it churned by the lot. Most volumes were bland, a few somewhat grand, but none ever climbed to the top spot. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Really interesting conclusion and very exciting paper. I have already a few questions in the chat. So without further ado, I would like to go to people who have asked questions, and I think there are different types of questions. So some are about the identification, I guess, of the effect of AI itself. Some are about the differences that you could see, for example, across genres, okay, and also use of AI that could potentially displays reading of books as well, right? Because if you consider, for example, self-help books, I think that's the point that Simon is making, that in the longer term, you can imagine customers talking directly to a conversational LLM for self-helps and not actually buying the self-help book. So this kind of this is like a different way to see a displacement effect. And then really thinks about the measurement of quality in different ways. So let me just quickly go to the question. So the first one by Catherine is, you say AI is responsible for the huge rise in book publishing, but is his assertion a conjecture? So, okay, we have millions of young people that radically change the labor market, and they may want or need to write books themselves, become influencers, be self-employed. So I guess that's probably the idea of new entrants could be younger people, I guess, and they use AI probably more. So how can you be sure that the rise in book is a rise in books driven by AI and not changing aspirations of new generations or new creators, new aspiring authors? Then there is a question that Simon asked about the use of LLM for self-help and so kind of displacement effect, and a question from so sorry if I missed the answer to this question. When you refer to quality, particularly quality distributions, are you using an economic science proxy like market performance, output concentration, or you consider the literary quality of works themselves? Asking because terms like mechanization of cultural production suggests cultural theory framing, but the metrics appear to be econometric. So the framework you suggest treats quality distribution as if it were uniform across literary fields, but genres and linguistic markets have radically different production logics. So are you modeling these differences? I think that's the question. And
so we should probably stop just so I can. I don't want to forget the questions. Maybe
I
should
sure.
Talk about the ones
yes.
you mentioned. They're all great questions, and I hope they're not disappearing into the mist of my memory already. The just 2 words about the first one because I had some thoughts. The first one was, shoot, what was
self-help?
Sorry.
Was this about the displacement of self-help books or
no? Before that one. Before that one.
The one about young people.
Oh, right, young people. So it is. I guess the question is, would young people, in the absence of AI, could young people have done this? It might be that there are these kinds of forces that are, sort of pushing young people to wish to express themselves. But now it's so darn easy to do it. We don't know the ages of people doing things, but I guess it's the timing of this coincident with. Essentially exactly coincident with the explosion of ChatGPT makes me think that's an important liberating force. Again, but the questioner's point, it could be who wants to do this, who wants to take advantage of the opportunity to produce in this way. That could very well be, and we wouldn't know given the kind of data we have. And before I forget, and then the question about quality, it's, again, to be clear, this is a very economic approach to the question. We're just trying to ask the question, which books are being used? We wish we could observe sales, and sales, of course, would not be the kind of metric that a cultural critic would necessarily rely on. I mean, it does in other cultural contexts, pretty strong positive correlations between sales and cultural success, and that may be surprising, but it's true, right? In music, it's like you got guys like Garth Brooks who sell a lot and aren't loved, but you got guys like Michael Jackson and the Beatles who sell a lot and critics also love. So the correlations tend to be, but still, we're not trying to say anything about what kind of cultural elites or literary types would infer from this. This could all, even what might be good news here to consumers could be. I understand perspectives from which this might be terrible news to others. Like some people think it's bad if other people consume things that aren't, let's say, refined. But economists don't tend to think that way, just professionally, maybe personally they do. So I take the point, but this is a very narrowly economic approach to the question. We're treating books as though they were products that generate sales, and sales generates the surplus for consumers the same way as when people buy hamburgers. And I, as a human, don't view books that way, but I, as an economist, analyze books that way.
Uh, Thank you. So there are some questions. There are one question in particular that I would like to pose because I do have a question myself about this. So Nick is asking if you explore other ways of measuring book quality, probably not in the current version, but perhaps using semantic complexity analysis of samples you extracted. Sales and ratings only tell us about market and reader perception, respectively, not quality directly, at least as I would understand it. So did the analysis also account for the fact that Amazon has consistent problems with spam reviews? I think this point about semantic analysis, I think it's because I was wondering to what extent you're capturing taste, right, in a way, and if LLMs, the best thing to do is to learn language and codify and then converge in terms of language. You're going to find a lot of books that are probably going to be quite similar in terms of more similar, and therefore there could be more uniform in terms of the types, right, rather than quality the way you measure it. And then of course there are a couple of questions, one by Alejandro, one by Tom, which I think is about differences in results across different types of genres, right? Because you can imagine that some genres, Alejandro thinks about in particular novel writing, or Tom is thinking more about non-fiction titles, right? Things could be different. So these two questions first, I think
Yeah.
they're yeah.
Yeah, no, there's lots of interesting stuff to chew on there. So I agree. I mean, I think the notion of looking at sort of internal measures of quality having to do with analysis of the text are very interesting. But I view them as very separate because the anchor that I tend to, and again, I don't dismiss it. I think it's a very interesting, different question. I mean, the anchor I tend to live with as an economist is human behavior. What causes people to buy stuff? It's only when people part with P dollars, and then we know they got more than P dollars worth of benefit from it, or at least they thought they were when they bought it. Whereas and I think also of think also of like recommendation engines, some of which use the characteristics of the product, and some of which use the tendency for one person to like a product as a prediction for whether the other person will like the product. At Pandora, they have that Human Genome Project, which turns out to be, as I understand it, not a very good way to recommend music. But what's a much better way to recommend music that people will like is to recommend to them people who like things that they like, something that other person likes. So now again, that doesn't really speak to the aesthetic quality. It could be the Human Genome Project was right, but I don't, that notion of right is outside of my field. That said, though, I think studying, if one could, studying the features of the writing would be quite interesting. I mean, one related thing that you mentioned was, about the sameness or the similarity, and are we getting more or less variety? And I think in one thing that's not in the paper that we looked a bit at, though, was like the distribution of books across not just these categories, but subcategories. Amazon has like a 5-level hierarchy of categories. And so one version of the kind of lack of variety one might worry about would be we just get a ton of romance novels and they're just romance. But I think what's more likely to be happening, and what we see in the data, is a filling out of all the possible, well, I shouldn't say all possible, but all of these existing subcategories. We get so many more books that we get books of all type. Now, that said, the style of the prose might be very convergent. I have no idea. So you could at the same time get more variety of topic, but less variety of style. And I have nothing to say about that, except that would be a very interesting thing to document.
Yeah, because sometimes, of course, if you want to measure surplus in terms of, or an increasing utility in terms of lower variety, I think that would be quite important. I think that's, I was wondering, there's a question in the chat. I was also thinking about this, whether in terms of the technology, there is a question on technology and helping maybe people getting into the book market, right? So because it's a cost reducing technology, you may be able to skip some steps, and of course the quality may not be great because the steps we're talking about might be improving the quality, right? So if you have a human editor likely the human editor is going to be able to it's not just a writer, right? There's also a process that leads you to produce better quality, and maybe the AI is not yet being able to give that added value. I think that's the question from Indy. And then we have a question from David on whether you think that this technology might over time tail off, right? So at the moment there's a bit of a hype, everybody's using it, wants to use it, then might actually tail off. And then I have, I think, it's probably a final question on is there a way to know if a book was created by AI or an author used AI? I think that's also, I think, a bit of a clarification question that I had in your measure of exposure, the way Pangram does it. Is it a percentage or is it?
Yes.
Can you clarify?
Yeah, no, these are great. Let me talk about this. So Pangram returns a fraction human. It turns out in the book sample, there's very few that have low fractions. They're either zero, or most of them are either zero or essentially 100%. There are a few that are between, which is interesting because we've looked at other things like academic articles where it's much more variable. And that also leads into these other two really interesting questions you just posed, like how is AI helpful? I mean, I think we're all grappling with this. All of us who write, academics who write, but also do in principle think and then write. I mean, of course, novelists do too. But I guess the question is how to use this in a way that actually might help us. And I think we're all, we can marvel at the fact that it can produce piles of text that resemble papers or books, but then you look at it carefully, and if you're a careful person, you think this isn't what I wanted. And so we have to learn how to use these tools so that they actually become complements to, to make us more productive. And that's the deep question so many of us in so many industries are facing. And that's also, I think, related to the tailing off question. We do, even in our data, we see that, it reached a peak in like October of 25, and it's fallen a bit since then. And I suspect, a lot of these books that people write with AI are receiving the number of reviews they get is zero, or number of ratings rather. So they're not selling any. The person who wrote 472 of them, I think the total number of ratings that person has received is really small. I shouldn't say there's no way, but it's hard for me to believe this is a very remunerative activity. So it could be that, there's a frenzy right now, and then it'll sort of settle down to people doing it only if it really generates some returns in excess of the cost. I mean, the cost is low to produce a pure piece of garbage, but to produce something good with AI, you've got to read it and think about it and reprompt, and it takes a bunch of time. So I don't know. Yeah, all great. It's early in the game, I think.
Yes, it is. And of course, I think the ultimate question will be also whether it is going to lead to an expansion of demand. Are people going to read more or read less? Is going to generate spillovers on society in a way or not. So I think we have reached the time. So I'd like to again thank you so much for your presentation, Joel. It's a really stimulating paper, and thank you for engaging with our audience and our questions. I would like also to give a warm warm thank you to everyone who's joined us online, and we of course hope to see you back at our next seminar, which is going to be on Thursday, the 2nd of July, with Dr. Valentina Montalto from Kedge Business School, presenting a paper on the role of tourist taxes in financing culture, with evidence from Italian municipalities. So I would like also to thank Simon, Emily, Tom, and Cecilia for technical support today, because without their help, of course, we wouldn't be here. And having said this, Joel, thank you so much again, and I hope to see everybody at the next seminar on the 2nd of July.
Thank you.
Thank you again.